and then agricultural breakdowns, which are going to make at least half of the world's population food insecure. So these are not the sort of things that would normally generate a strong state. I think we're going to see dissolution in more places than we have. Well, we are definitely going to see state dissolution in more places than we have seen for the last 75 years. We've been living in the most charmed period in human history. For the countries that can make a go of it, it all depends upon how reliable their food and their energy supplies are and whether or not they can muster the internal finance to generate their own supply chains. That's easier with large polities than it is with small ones. So the United States, it's energy self-sufficient. It's a massive energy agricultural exporter. Its baby boomers are retiring, but as a percentage of their overall population, their baby boomer class is actually the smallest in the world. And so their financial crunch isn't going to be nearly as bad. They've got Mexico next door with a healthy demography. They've got Canada for raw materials, the Western Hemisphere for raw materials. The United States can grow through all of these problems. And even there, we are going to see the state gain additional power. In Europe, you're going to lose 4 to 5 million barrels a day of crude from the Russians within a couple of months. The only way you keep the lights on in Europe is to go and reinterface with the former colonies in Africa and force them to redirect their flows to Europe. To survive in the world that we are going to, Europe has to become neocolonial. How is that compatible with now what we understand as liberal multi-party democracy? We're going to find out. Remember, the entire economic model that the world is based on, whether it's fascism or communism or socialism or capitalism, it's all based on the concept that the pie is either stable or getting bigger, usually because of population growth. Well, now it's going to get smaller because of population collapse. At the same time, it's going to break into pieces. Everyone's going to have to find their own way to navigate that. And if democracy is something to be preserved, it goes into the mix in terms of a value statement that you can or cannot preserve. I'm far more worried about Central European and Southern European democracy than I am about Northern or Western, because Northern or Western has the capacity to go out and get some of what they need. They're going to be a little hypocritical about it when they do it, but the alternative for them is to deindustrialize. Assuming for the moment you've got the food and the raw materials and the energy and the finance, which we've already eliminated 80% of the world's countries. Assuming you've got that, we're moving into a period where the younger generation is smaller than it's ever been. That would suggest that labor is actually going to have a leg up in those societies. We're certainly seeing that in the United States. It may not be the political democracy that we always have said that we're after, but there is a degree of economic democracy that I think strengthens any sort of democratic system. So that is definitely happening here. We have seen greater wage appreciation in the last 2 years in the United States than we have in the last 20 for the lower tier economically, and I think that's great to a degree. It's also inflationary. That's another problem. In countries that don't have those inputs, however, the world's probably going to look a lot more like Pakistan, where there's a functional slave class because so many things are in scarcity that whoever can control their supply is the one with the power. Well, we're testing the bounds because we've never done this before. The closest existing system to that would be the fascism as practiced by the Nazis, where they experienced technocratic government control of the means of production, the means of consumption, the means of communication. What the Chinese are doing right now is that kind of on steroids. There's an open question if the World War II had not happened, whether or not it could continue to contain German society. We don't know. So we have a example list of 0 here for knowing if this works. On the negative side, let's start with that. When the Arab Spring hit Egypt, there was a rebellion against the Mubarak government that the military approved of. And so they allowed all the technological means of communication to continue. 2 years later, when it was the military who didn't like the government, they shut it off. There were only 2 places where internet cables come into the country. They cut them both. They disabled the cell towers, and they were able to easily overthrow the government. Within a year, the Russians were in Egypt to study what the generals did. And they went back home and they put kill switches on all the cables that come into Russia. There's only 4 of them. And have done kind of a poor man's version of what the Chinese have done within Russia, and it's been very effective. Now, they're also at war now, but I would argue 85% of the Russian population, even if they were freed from the propaganda, would still support the Russian government's war aims. And the people that refused are the people who left. And that's probably 500,000 people by now. But that's all of them. So when you look at a situation like China, that system is stable until it's not. As long as certain basic needs, as the Chinese define them, are met, it works. There's no risk of rebellion in China until those needs are no longer being met. So until now, I really didn't have a lot of hope for any sort of popular uprising. The math may be changing now. We now have an endless COVID lockdown. That's their new normal. There's a food insecurity issue because they can't get African swine fever out of their pork herd. There's an energy issue because of what's going on with the Russian war and deglobalization in general. And the world writ large is starting to look at Taiwan from the point of view of an American hawk, and that there's nothing here that we can talk about anymore. It's just a question of how we protect ourselves or how we fight back against it. And in that environment, perhaps, the math will change because life will no longer be stable for the average Chinese citizen. But I wouldn't bet that's going to go in a cooperative direction from the West's point of view, because it's just as likely to spawn a massive outpouring of globalization as well. But I mean, the bottom line is we don't know. We've never seen this before. When it was with telegraph and the fax machine, that democratized communications. That's part of why the Soviet Union fell. But this is the opposite. This is a complete information control state. And we're going to be studying this for the next century, no matter how it goes.
It's a brave new world.
I wouldn't read too much in that. It's not like he's got 50% of the total, or 5% of the total, or half of 1% of the total, or half of 1,000th of 1% of the total. You don't have to own a large chunk of land in the United States to be the single largest owner, because there's a lot of land.
Right. Okay.
Also, our single biggest single investor, the country that owns the most American farmland is Canada, and it's about 2% of the total, and everyone else combined is less than 3%. So it really is broken down into tiny, tiny, tiny bits. Well, on the macro side, there's the whole stocks versus bonds issue. Stocks require a stable system with a lot of liquidity. That's not going to exist in a lot of places. I see most of the world's smaller stock markets just going away. Bonds is the way that larger companies and governments have obviously raised money, and there's going to be a lot of that in the future, but the cost of it is going to be extreme because the need is going to be massive, but the people who actually have investment capital are relatively limited. So I think if you start by thinking of the dark doldrums of the mid-70s in the immediate aftermath of the oil crisis, if you're not ready for at least that, you're not going to have the stomach for what's coming. So that's just kind of like the bare minimum that you should consider. It'll probably never be that good, but if you can't deal with that now, you probably need to find another career. On the bigger side, like the uber macro, one of the unfortunate facts is that every currency system that has ever been backed by a metal throughout history has ultimately failed by its success. Because if you have a successful currency system that people trust, people want to use it. They want to use it for a medium of trade. They want to use it as a store of value. And if they do that, eventually so many people will be piling into your currency that you're going to need more metal to support it. And so you're going to have to expand physically to get the metal. Go to war to get the metal.